Hello, Lee here from Covert Craft. Recently returned from Spoonfest, which was a spoon carving event hosted in Edale in the Peak District in the middle of England. There was a really good turnout this year, lots of attendance from all over the world. Some really top class spoon carvers were there demonstrating their skills and running courses and sharing their knowledge with everybody. Got to meet some of the people that I know through Facebook and other social media, which was really good. Also some of my customers, which is superb. Yeah, basically really good event. I did take quite a lot of footage while I was there. Unfortunately, I've had a little bit of a disaster with the computer while I was transferring the footage. Not quite sure what happened, but some of the files managed to get corrupted, including the aerial footage I got, which was a shame. So I've managed to scrape together a little video here, which is now containing, unfortunately, some really low-res footage that I managed to salvage from the card. But the reason I've decided to post this is it's mostly audio that's important in this video. It's some really interesting information about finishing spoons and the type of oils and processes that you can go through to get a really good finish and a fairly quick drying result with your oil. Some of it requires a little bit of effort, as you'll hear in the video, but it's presented by a friend of mine called Don from America who travelled over especially for the event, and so I attended this talk and found it thoroughly fascinating, so I thought it'd be worth editing the bits together and sharing it with you. Hopefully there'll be some of you out there that'll find this information really useful. I certainly did, and I'm definitely going to be trying some of the techniques that Don explains. So I'll hand you over to Don now. Once again, apologies for the video quality, but hopefully all the information that you need you'll be able to gain from the audio.
But I'll start with some really basic stuff. First, I guess I got to say that you don't have to oil your spoons. There are lots and lots of people who don't. There's no real need for it. Over time, it's just going to naturally develop patina and it'll be protected. It's not like it's necessarily going to make the spoon last longer or be any more sanitary. It's all a question of how you whether you like the appearance of it when it's oiled and the finish and feel of it. But if you are going to oil, then you want to use the right sort of oil. So there's a whole lot of oils, and I'll say right up front, any kind of oil will dry ultimately if you do the right things with it. And if you think about crude oil, it's been in the earth for millions upon millions of years, and that's what they use to make plastic. So it's all about what you do to it. So, but in general, we want to use drying oils. And the primary drying oils, there's a couple of different, there's two primary types. There's conjugated oils and non-conjugated oils. Okay. And the best example of a conjugated oil is linseed oil. And basically what that means is oils are composed of all these long chains of molecules, fatty acids. And conjugated oils are more heavily linked together to begin with. And once the reaction starts going, it's almost as if you put a catalyst in. So like, say, tung oil, you know that if you've used it as a woodworker, you've got to keep it completely free of oxygen in the bottle. You drop bearings or marbles or something in there, because what happens is as soon as it starts going, it'll go through the whole thing. And if that starts, within 2 weeks you end up with a solid bit of crystallized kind of polymer stuff in the bottle that's totally useless. And then unconjugated oils, which are still long chains of fatty acids, but not as many linkages in between. So you get 0, 1, or 2 linkages depending on what it is. So the drying oils on that side are linseed oil, which is kind of the fastest drying of the lot. And then you have linseed oil, walnut oil. There's rapeseed oil, poppy seed oil. There's a whole variety of drying oils. But the kind of most used are obviously walnut and linseed oil because they're more naturally going to form a polymer sooner and create those bonds. So linseed oil, the reason linseed oil is so unique is it's got a really high content, about 60% of linoleic acid, which has 2 bonds between the chains. So it actually polymerizes much faster. And if you had only linoleic acid, which is like I said, the primary fatty acid in it, it would actually cure really fast. But because there's linoleic acid and oleic acid in there as well, both of which dry much slower, it slows the whole thing down. So if you have raw linseed oil, and if you're lucky enough, you can get really nice cold press Swedish stuff, which there's a huge difference based on the latitude how much linoleic acid is in there based on the altitude. So if it's grown in the south, instead of being 60%, it can drop down to as much as, or as little as 30%. So the oil from the south actually takes about 2 to 3 times longer to dry. So when this is, this has been filtered, but this is from Sweden. Very nice, quite clear, no processing other than the initial filtering after the cold pressing. But a lot of us can't get our hands on this, or it's very, very expensive. And even that takes a really long time to dry.
Yeah.
So the basic idea of how this dries is it's not like a paint or anything. It's not a vapor process. You're not getting rid of a solvent or anything and forming a film, but instead it's actually cross-linking, pulling oxygen from the atmosphere and forming polymer. And it's all this big, insanely long chain reaction of all these different peroxyls and things that goes through, and honestly nobody really understands the whole thing from beginning to end. Like there are people who write papers that cover like this much of the process. So it's like kind of crazy complex stuff, but it takes months, if not years, for raw linseed oil to dry. You'll get a film, it'll set on the outside, but as soon as that happens, it makes it more challenging for it to pull oxygen out of the air. Raw linseed oil will gain about 40% of its mass from oxygen, straight from the air. So it takes a lot of oxygen for it to polymerize. And as soon as that film forms, well then the oxygen's actually going to pass through that film, and it gets progressively slower and slower the further it has to go for that oxygen to get to it and actually turn it into a polymer. So one of the first things you can do is, and then it's all preference, but if you soak your spoons, and this is one that's been soaked and it's kind of got this unique sort of quality to it, and a lot of people like that, and it adds weight. But it's only the top layer that's set and just barely cured. If you were to cut this open, you'd see that everything below the surface, literally, this is probably 6 months old, so, literally a couple atoms thick, molecules where it's polymerized and everything else is still just slowly pulling oxygen through all those other layers. And it may take 2, 3, 4, 20 years for it to dry all the way through. So unless you really love the weight of that spoon, and you've got plenty of oil to waste, there's really no reason to use, do a long soak. The thinner you do it, because of the nature of it having to have oxygen from the atmosphere, the faster it's going to set and cure. So in practice, I actually literally just wipe it on with my hands. Real quick, thin layer, and I immediately wipe it off. And that way, it's the thinnest layer possible on there. That's going to set very fast, usually within 24 hours or less. And we'll get into ways to make it less. And within a week, that'll be fully cured because it's just a few molecules thick. And then you can do another layer on top of that and build up layers, thin layers faster. And then you've really got something that you can set this out in the sun and it's 30 degrees in the full sun and it's not going to sweat oil, it's not going to get sticky. It's cured. It's truly a polymer at that point. So a couple of things impact how fast it cures. And the two primary things are temperature and sunlight. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it. So like oleic acid, which is completely lacking the links of some of the other acids, dries very slowly. So that's your baseline. Whereas linoleic acid dries about 700 times faster. But in full sunlight, where you've got UV rays hitting it, the oleic acid will dry about 30,000 times faster. And it's just because of the interaction with the sunlight, and it actually drives a lot of the catalytic kind of chain processes that form the polymer. And whereas, interestingly enough, the linoleic acid actually dries faster, but it starts off 700 times faster. When you get in the sunlight, it only increases its drying speed of about 100, 200. But overall, the effect is that if you actually do a real thin layer and sat that outside and for about 2 to 3 hours in some really strong direct sunlight, it'll actually set in that time period. And the other thing is when you do it in the sunlight, part of the process is that when it's cross-linking, because of the activity of the photons hitting it and keeping it all agitated, it actually dries clearer. So these both are almost the same color wood. This was a little bit paler. This was oiled and left in my workshop, which has zero natural lighting, and it's much more yellow. So just that whole thing of actually getting it in direct sunlight, when you do that oiling, can actually make a noticeable difference in how much it yellows or not.
So does that mean if you put it behind glass, that will affect it?
It depends. So if you put it in your car, like say on the dashboard, it's going to have less impact than if it's in standard light, because most car windows have UV coatings to reduce the amount of UV that comes in. So there's definitely an impact. I have just some plate glass that I've built a little thing. Interesting thing, squirrels really love the smell of linseed oil. And I used to set them out on the deck, and they'd disappear, and I couldn't figure out what the hell was happening with them. And then I found a few with little, chewed up a bit, and then I discovered that the squirrels like to steal them and chew on them. So I built a little plate glass, it's about this big, greenhouse, and I can set them out there and not worry about the squirrels running off with them. So it's it's a little bit crazy, but it works. So just getting that extra sunlight helps it set faster. The other thing is heat. So adding heat will help the oil polymerize a lot faster as well. And you may have seen people and heard people say, oh, I use olive oil, and I just throw it in the oven at like 200 C for half an hour until it starts smoking, and I pull it out, and it sets. And it really does. You can get almost any oil to set if it's that additional temperature actually drives it. But that's what's unique about linseed oils, it doesn't need it. But if you were to take a spoon, right after you've done that first light coat of oil, put it in the oven at 100 C, just for 1 hour. It'll set, and it accelerates the whole process about 70 to 100 times for it actually to hit a cure. So just that little bit of extra time with that extra heat, again, will help drive that set faster and get it much further along the way to fully curing. If you've got the opportunity to leave it in an oven overnight, it'll actually fully cure overnight.
Switched on, leave the oven running.
Yeah, but at a very low temperature, but it's enough to make a big difference. So if you're off to a show in a day or two and you really want things not to sweat, then that's what you can do. And it makes a huge difference, it really does. I've done tests where I've used linen paper and tried the various oils and cut them up and time them and stick them in the oven, and then you can just drop it in water and see if it forms a rainbow on the top. If it's not set, it takes minuscule amounts for you to actually see the sheen on the top of the water if you're in natural light. So I've kind of done a lot of little analysis and tests to see what works. So that's the two big things you can do to influence it substantially. The other thing is that humidity has a fairly large impact, which is unfortunate for you all because the more humid it is, the slower the whole process is. It actually slows it down. Interestingly, the moisture content in the wood, if it's bone dry, takes longer than if it's got, like, say, 5 to 10% moisture content. You know, whatever your kind of equilibrium is here is probably a little bit higher, but for whatever reason, the moisture in the wood actually can help drive that process. And I'll cover it a little bit as to why when I talk about some of these other oils I brought. So that's kind of the two big things you can do. So sunlight and heat kind of makes a world of difference. Thin coats, so they actually have an opportunity to cure all the way through. And then when I do a second coat, usually I do it, so if I've done some coal roasting, I'll do the first oiling and let that set. I even burnish it. Then I'll do the coal roasting and oil it. And I won't use heat set on that because that can actually cause, it doesn't take much for it to actually get a little strange convection action. It'll drive whatever you're using as a pigment right out of the channel. So you have to do the sunlight and just let it sit for about a week, and then I'll do one last layer to really seal that in. So kind of it can make things messy if you try and rush it. You know, so I use instant coffee, you know, little Nescafe. I find the crystals work really well, and if you give it the opportunity then to set, then it's fairly durable finish. So the other thing that I do, since I can't get access to Swedish oil without, you know, selling one of my children, but I can get access to bulk organic cold pressed linseed oil. So for me to buy a gallon costs about $30, which is actually really quite cheap because I can get a pint of Albex or Tried and True, which is made in the States, is about the same price. So gallon versus a pint, it's worth the effort. You can actually hand refine your linseed oil. Sounds like a lot of work, and it can be, but you can actually keep it fairly simple. So the things that make linseed oil in particular very yellowy, especially raw linseed oil, is mucilage. That's the biggest. There's
Sorry, can you say that again?
mucilage.
Okay.
And what mucilage is the bit in the seed that when it gets wet swells up and holds water. So if you've ever had actual flax seeds and used them for baking, they get kind of slimy and weird. Or like chia seeds, you know, you make chia pudding. That's all. It's because there's just massive amounts of mucilage. And the whole point of mucilage is to hold on to water. But when it dries, it actually turns yellowish, brownish color, and that's what causes most of the yellowing when you use raw linseed oil that's completely unrefined. So if you can get rid of the mucilage, then you can improve the quality of the oil, you can improve the clarity, and how, when it goes on, it'll dry clear in comparison. So what I do is I do a series of washes. So not only do I want to get rid of the mucilage, I want to get rid of some of the phospholipids and the water-soluble acids, because again, those are the things that go rancid and make oil not so great in raw oil. You know, it doesn't happen often with linseed oil, but other oils will go rancid, and it's because of the high, you know, amount of the phospholipids and the water-soluble fatty acids that cause that. So again, I want to try and get those out. So the process is pretty simple. I actually use washes with salt water and sand, and that actually, the salt water in combination with the ions that are naturally in the water when it comes out of the tap, kind of creates a process where if you mix that up with the sand and water, so you agitate and create an emulsion, just creates a massive amount of surface area that's interfacing between the water and the oil. And what happens then is it can actually do an interchange and help take oxygen actually out of the water, just atmospheric oxygen that's dissolved in the water, will actually go into the oil and start driving that early oxygenation and do pre-polymerization. The hotter temperature you can do it, so I use tap water, and I actually, for that, crank the heater up just a little bit when I'm doing this process. As hot as I can possibly manage, so I'll use 1 part oil and then 2 parts of water that's had about 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup of salt in it, and then about 1/2 cup of really coarse sand. And I wash the sand to get rid of anything that's material. It entraps all the oil, and you end up having a lot of waste. And you agitate that, and what's happening is there, so as I said, you're kind of getting more oxygen into the oil, but everything that's water soluble is actually dissolving into the water. So you do that process, keep agitating it, let it separate, and then you can actually filter off after it's separated and do that process a couple of times. So you can do multiple washes, and then you can do a rinse with just straight water. And depending on how far you go with it is how good it turns out. So my oil, when I get it, is like almost dark green. And it's really, it smells green, and it's cloudy and pretty, it doesn't look like anything you'd want to put on your spoon. People do use it like that, and it's fine, but it takes a long time to cure. But this, so this is, let's see, I'll find the right one here. Yeah, this has been, had 3 washes and 3 rinses, and it was done about 20 months ago. And after I'm done with that process, I'll leave it in a windowsill in a clear jar, because at that point the sunlight's a positive thing. It helps to continue to drive that pre-oxygenation. And if you've got a gap in the jar, so sometimes I'll use like a quart jar or something, and it'll be half full, you'll find that it'll actually continue pulling oxygen out of the atmosphere inside the bottle. Leave it under vacuum. And if you wait too long, it can be really difficult to open. But the more it's exposed to sunlight during that process, the continues to bleach it and drive that oxygenation and polymerization. So this stuff is dry to the touch in about 30 minutes without a heat set or anything.
Wow.
So it's kind of this thing, it seems like this really long process, but when I did this batch, I did about a quarter, and this is the very last. So it lasts a long time, and it's sitting there, and as I get closer, I'll do another batch, and I'll just leave them there so there's things going on. But if you want to do more washes or try some different things, so that it's hard to see in this little tiny one, but it's quite clear, and this was only processed about 2 months ago, but it's had 4 washes and, well, more than 4 washes and 12 rinses, and I did that in March, kind of mid to late March. And the thing is every time you do a wash or rinse, you're taking more of that water soluble stuff. Ultimately, if you get it all out, then it's not going to yellow much. So you can speed up the whole process, but if you're willing to wait and let it sit in the sun without a whole lot of effort, you get this. This is also processed in March. And this was 3 washes with 9 rinses, but I actually did a hydrogen peroxide wash and left it in emulsion for about 2 weeks. And I was doing a bit of research and reading, and the thing is with hydrogen peroxide, when you put it in sunlight, it actually just breaks down into water and oxygen. Well, you need that extra oxygen in your oil, so by leaving it in an emulsion, that actually seems, and I've done a little bit of testing with it, and I'll have to continue to see long-term whether it does, but that is more pre-polymerized than normal because it's able to take up a lot more oxygen initially. So instead of having to pull 40% of its own weight out of the atmosphere and oxygen because of all the washes and what it pulled, in terms of dissolved oxygen out of the water and the H2O, this might only have to pull 15% of the air before it actually turns into a polymer. The thing about this is that you can apply the same process to any raw oil. So, you're going to have the same issue with especially seeded oils tend to have really high amounts of mucilage. Less so with walnut oil, but it still is going to clear it out and help it to polymerize faster and ultimately give you a cleaner finish. So I'll talk a little bit too. If you use raw linseed oil, you may have noticed that your spoons ultimately end up with kind of a matte finish. And the thing is because it's pulling all of that oxygen out of the atmosphere, it's gaining mass. But if you've just got this thin film on the surface, as it gains mass, it swells up, and if you were to look at it under a microscope, you'd see all these little microscopic ridges. And that's how the matte finish occurs. And so the more pre-polymerized your oil is, the more oxygen that it's already taking in, the less that's going to be. So you can get a film that may just get tiny little ridges instead of, the slightly larger ones. And so you get more of a high luster the more you've allowed it to be exposed to oxygen. One of the other things you can do is if you want an oil that's thicker and dries super fast, is kind of do a sun thickening. And the thinner the oil is, the more, because as soon as the sun rays hit it, it's actually absorbing that UV light and it's causing reactions. And that photon basically dies out. It's transferred its energy into the oil. It's done its magic. So the thinner you spread the oil out, the more the impact the sunlight has. So if you were to put it in a big flat container, and I've done this, and leave it in the sun for even just 2 or 3 days, depending on how thin it is, it will thicken up, and that'll actually absorb tons of oxygen really fast because it's got more surface area, more interaction with the sun, which really drives that process. So you end up with an oil that's thicker. And the downside to that is it's hard to put a really thin coat of a thicker oil on. So you can heat the spoon or the oil to thin it out a bit and get a thinner coat. And the same thing works with any drying oil. So again, I've done most of this with linseed oil, but in fact it'll still work with walnut oil or rapeseed oil, whatever you choose to use. So all these little things can kind of add up and you can get better results. So even if you do get that bit of a matte finish and you want a higher luster, the trick to that is well, you've got to get rid of those little microscopic ridges, and that's where burnisher comes into play. And you can use anything to burnish. This is a room corn burnisher, and it's kind of a traditional method for, like, say, French polishing. And I have done a lot of traditional woodworking, so when I started doing spoons, I kind of thought, oh, that'd be interesting to try and use that on spoons. And it does make a big difference. So not only is it getting rid of those little microscopic ridges, but it's actually compressing the fiber of the wood overall and giving you this kind of smoother finish. In fact, it almost feels a bit waxy.
Yes.
The trick is you got to do it at the right time, because if you don't use oil and you burnish, as you use the spoon, just as if you were to, say, sand, and over time that grain's going to raise up. If you haven't raised it and very carefully done a proper job, same thing happens with burnishing. So you've got to really combine the burnishing with an oil that cures and is going to lock those compressed fibers in place. So that, for me, the timing that I've worked out is I'll do a heat set in the evening after my wife has gone to bed. Because she hates the smell of linseed oil.
Mine too, yeah.
And there's a reason why people don't like the smell of linseed oil. Some of us naturally can smell aldehydes, so that's like all the volatile kind of compounds that come off it, like ketones and esters and ethers and alcohols. Some people are just naturally much more sensitive to that, and so they smell that, and that's all they can smell. It smells chemically and foul. And some of us aren't really sensitive to it. And so for us, it smells kind of green and nice and not a big deal. So I do it after hours, after she's gone to bed. And I'll do a 1-hour heat set. And I just leave it in the oven overnight. And then in the morning, I'll burnish them all. Because at that point, the oil's set. And I can compress the fibers. And within the next 4 to 5 days, as that fully cures, it actually locks all those fibers in. So if you do it at the right time, you end up with this really smooth, kind of luscious finish that is not going to be impacted by use. In time, when they wear all the way through that oil, well, then you'll notice a difference, and that's the natural thing. But in general, it's a much more durable and long-lasting finish when you do that burnishing, because you're actually compressing the fibers, you're increasing the density of the wood along the surface, so it just makes it more durable. But you don't need one of these. You can burnish with anything, and in fact, it doesn't even have to be harder than the wood you're burnishing. It helps. It just needs to be smooth. In a pinch, I've used all kinds of things. A metal spoon, that's about the only thing it's good for. But you can burnish with a metal spoon. This is a jeweler's burnisher for burnishing soft metals when you do like a ring setting on a cabochon. But it works really well. You know, you can get in there and soften all those irises. You can get into the bowl and polish it. And sometimes I even use the base, but I marked my tools just before I left, and then when I got here, well, that was a really stupid place to mark that. But anything will work. You could even use a plastic shampoo bottle from a hotel.
Cigarette lighter, that's quite well.
Yeah, yeah, I mean anything. And again, all you're doing is just rubbing across the surface and compressing those fibers, and then in conjunction with the oiling, that finish will stay, as long as you have a spoon. The one thing that's also really important, if you do decide to oil and you want to make sure those oils set fast, is really working on your finish in general. Get to that point where you've got a really nice, clean knife finish, because the smoother that surface is, the less oil it takes to actually cover it, and therefore it's going to dry faster. If you've got a pretty coarse spoon, and it's fine, but some people, I'm done, let's move on to the next one. But that's actually going to take more oil, which means it's going to take longer to cure. So if you strive to have a really nice knife finish, or if you can't quite get the perfect knife finish, then try a scraper. And the thing about a scraper is a good, nice, sharp scraper. And I'll do a couple of scrapes here. You take a look at what's come out of there. It's actually little shavings. It's not just dust. It's actually pulling shavings. And I haven't really flattened it, so it's just kind of taken out the high points. But once that bowl's totally flat, it'll roll a shaving across the whole bottom of that bowl. And that is, a really quite finished surface, and not quite as nice as a good knife finish. But it's unlike using sandpaper. It's severed the fibers. Yes, so again, you've got a really nice finish. And if you want to push it further, you can sand. If it's good enough for Willison, it's good enough for me. But the thing is that if you've scraped and you need to sand, you don't need to start with anything much less than 400 grit. So you start fairly fine, and it takes almost no effort at all to clean that up. And most people, if they do sand, they don't go much beyond this. But it doesn't take much. A little bit of 400. And what I do is very quickly go through the grits. And if I'm going to sand, I don't sand a whole spoon. I don't like that look. I do like the tool finish. But I sometimes, if I'm doing coal roasting, I may like a very smooth finish, so I'll scrape and sand that, especially if I'm doing it in the bowl. But sometimes I just like that contrast of having a real smooth inside of the bowl and then everything else natural curves. So I'll sand through 3 grits. So I'll do 400, 600, and then 800, and I'll wet it and let it dry and raise the grain. But because I'm going to such a high grit, it doesn't raise very much. After it's done, I'll go back one more time with the 800, then 1,000, or I use micron polishing paper. And this is like kind of like a non-woven. It's sort of like Tyvek with micron graded finish or polish on there, and it's very quick. So this one's about equivalent about 1,200. The next one up is 2,400, and then about 4,000, 8,000, and I have one more that goes to 12,000, which just seems like overkill. But the thing is if you've already scraped it, instead of spending hours sanding and wetting to get to that nice smooth finish, because it's already started a lot finer than most people would sand, you can get a really nice finish with not a whole lot of effort. And it's literally that much is all it takes to go through the different grits. And get a fairly smooth finish. And this really will not raise much. And if you oil this, so that took all of 2 minutes. That's the one I just did, just the front half. again, even if there was the slightest bit of tendency for that grain to raise, it won't if you allow that oil to actually set and cure. It'll lock it in place.
Yeah.
And then you combine that with the burnishing, so you get a really very fine finish. So this has been scraped in the bowl and in the handle. And you can see there's still texture. There's still, you know, but it's very easy and quick to do it that way. So if you feel like you've got a result, you know, you want to use it, then you got to do it right. Sandpaper is not for removing wood and shaping it. It's just for finishing. And so if you do everything properly and up to that point, and then combining it with the oils and using heat set or using just the sun to drive that faster, you're going to get much better results. So I would highly encourage people to really try the thinnest possible coat you can get on there. Don't even do the, oh, I've oiled it and I'm moving on, I'm going to do 50 spoons and I'll go back and take off any excess. I rub it on and immediately take everything off. You want the thinnest possible layer you can get on, because then it'll cure. And that's the difference, you know. So it'll drive some significant improvement in the quality of it.
What do you use to wipe? Do you just use a rag?
Yeah, I just use a rag or a towel like this. You know, you can see it's quite stained with oil. I generally just get my hands. So these ones are quite nice, actually. It's just a little squeeze bottle. I'll just put a couple of drops on, and in time your hands get kind of coated with anyway. So I'll just do it and then wipe it down and move on to the next one. But it makes a huge difference. So you just need to think in terms of the fact that it's not going to cure without oxygen, and that defeats the purpose when it actually creates that little layer right from the beginning. So there's no reason, unless you really like that feel. And there's certain times, like with birch, if you do that soak and a few other woods where it really turns translucent and changes the quality of it. Yeah, you're going to do that, but you got to recognize that because of the nature of how the oil cures, that spoon for the next year or 2 or 3 may sweat oil when you put it out in the sun, or if it gets in a warm room. And you kind of have to live with that.
I found that in cold temperatures as well. I've got a box of oiled spoons that I've soaked, and I take them into a colder environment, they will often sweat.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is just driven through like the atmospheric changes as well, change in humidity. And as things naturally shift the moisture in and out of the wood, it actually can move the oil as well.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess that's it. I don't know if you had any other specific questions, but
Only one on, you touched on filtering,
yeah.
but how do you do it?
So you can literally just, you know, if it's cloudy and it's got, you know, if you, the stuff you get is like, say, horse feed, and it's got a certain amount of debris.
Yeah.
I actually just do like, you know, 20 layers of cheesecloth. Like, you're just mechanically removing anything heavy. But when you do, if you do the salt and sand wash,
yeah,
all that'll get entrapped within the sand and the mucilage.
Right.
Just naturally happens. And it'll settle out in time too.
So you just skim the oil off the top?
Yep. So I use like, you know, a basting ball.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And pull it off. And I also have, when I really get to the final stages where I really want to make sure I'm getting as little water as possible, I'll use a big syringe with a big 4-inch, you know, needle to take that last bit out of there. And a lot of times I'll combine that and put it all into another jar until the next time I do a cycle or something.
What do your neighbors think of you?
I don't know, because, you know, my office window has got like 10, 15 jars of, you know, yellow, pale yellow stuff. I don't know.
There's Don at the Giants.
I've got a question. You were saying about the sun setting,
yeah,
lightening the look of the oil.
Yeah.
And then you went on to talk about heat setting and putting it in the oven.
Mm-hmm.
Just thinking back to previous conversations we had about popping colours and toasting and things like that.
Yeah.
Will the heat treat help lighten the oil, or does that go the other way?
It generally goes the other way. If you go high enough to actually change the wood, you're accelerating the polymerization process, and sometimes if it goes too fast, it'll actually start to darken the oil a little bit. But it all depends on how you go. I mean, depending on the woods. So this is tulip poplar that's been darkened, and I did that at about, I think, It must have been about 210
Yeah.
C.
So
And
that's a lot higher than 100 C.
right, yeah, exactly. And I don't think I had any issues with this, but I've tried, like with say maple sometimes, and I've noticed that if there's places where the grain is picked up in oil, suddenly it gets much darker. So it does have some impact, kind of toasting it to do it. My suggestion is that if you're going to toast the wood to darken it, is to do that before you put the oil on. And that's how I do it now. So if I want to darken wood that's plain, I'll toast it and then turn the oven off and just wait until the temp reads, you know, around 130 or so. I'll start boiling them and just tossing them back in. And then I'll do the heat set at that point. But if you do it too high, it can have an impact. Yeah? Yeah, you know, it's funny. I've thought about trying to build like a little UV cabinet, and it would work.
Nail dryers.
What's that?
Nail dryers.
Oh,
UV cure.
that's a good idea.
You've got one at home.
Yeah, and so all of that would help drive it. But you know, really honestly, that first couple of hours, if you can get it in the sunlight and do it on a day when it's sunny, like it's been today or yesterday, it's good enough. And really, it makes a huge difference.
You know, that was our whole summer then.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot you do around. You talked about this frame, the cold frame.
Yeah.
So you still get heat.
Yeah, you absolutely do, and it's you know, you're still going to get exposure, and so getting it outside in that natural light makes a really big difference. You know, my test with the paper, even with unwashed oil in the sunlight, stuff that had sat outside for like 2 days was pretty much cured on the paper. You know, nothing came off of it versus the stuff that I left in my workshop, which is in the basement. So that's, you know, one little tiny window of natural light. You know, even after like 3 months, it would still come off the paper. So big difference, you know, like a factor of 50 or 60 even, so.
The other thing with baking is occasionally you've got sticky film, which is actually quite difficult to scrape.
Yeah, and so that's the key. You want the thinnest possible coat you can get. If you do a soak or you put too much oil on there, you will definitely get that. And then what happens is it does, I mean, linseed oil in particular, that's why they use it for paints, is it forms a continuous film very quickly. And if you've got a lot sitting on the surface, what happens is you've got that film kind of floating on top of oil that's not cured. And as it varies in thickness in some places, it may have locked down other parts, and it's, you know, all intermingled and it's very messy. So you really want to use the thinnest possible coat. And usually what I do is if I am doing a heat set, I'll put it in the oven and set the timer for about 15 minutes, and I'll check. Because they're even trying to be as careful as I can. There'll be a few spoons. If there's any standing oil, I'll wipe that and rub it all down. Because you don't want any standing oil, because that will happen. So
I've been getting it all wrong.
I mean, you know, part of it is that, like, I know that Villa, that was his thing. He would just dunk it in oil for days and just kind of forget about it.
Big vat.
Right, and then pull it out. And so I think so many of us are influenced by that.
Yeah.
And that there's nothing wrong with that, but there are, you know, downsides, and you have to be willing to accept those downsides. And if you're not willing to accept those downsides and you still want oil, then you can do it a bit smarter and get better results.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Absolutely superb. Yeah.
So you can set them at 100 degrees.
Yeah, and I did that for a while, actually. I used a slow cooker set on high, and I would just throw it in there, and I'd even do it with just like totally still very green wood. You'd see all the moisture boil out.
Yeah.
I'd wait until they sank to the bottom, and they were just really saturated, and they were really heavy.
I was thinking just...
And it gets dry to the touch very quick, but, you know, like anything, because it's so much, it won't. If you do a quick dump and wipe it off, it would probably work. I would think it'd be nearly as effective. Anytime you heat, I mean, you can heat treat the oil as well, in fact. Do the same thing with the sun treat. pour it in a thin layer in a sheet and pop it in the oven. Same thing in about, as cool as you can possibly go. So if when I've done tests with that, I do it 170 F. So what's that, like 80 C? You know, so it's not as hot, and you got to be careful because you don't want to film. And when I've done it, I've set a timer, and I'll go in and stir it every 15 minutes so that a film won't form. But that heat treat actually drives the same thing, but it also thickens up the oil. So I think effectively, if you're doing it in a deep fryer, you're going to get some of that heat treat effect, and then the additional heat is going to help. But I think it's, you know, the longer it's exposed to the heat, the longer you get the impact of it, but you don't want it to be saturated. So that's kind of why I've picked the oven method. It seems kind of be the best compromise. And when it's really sunny, sometimes I just do it in the little things. That little box gets white pretty at times. Yeah, I open it up and you can literally feel the heat just roll out of it. Yeah.
Question on the rinsing and everything. So you put sand, salt, and water, shake it up, siphon off the oil once it's all settled.
Yeah.
Just keep repeating. What's the rinse?
So rinse is just literally just with water, tap water. And same thing, as hot as water as you can handle. Just helps the mucilage and phospholipids and stuff dissolve better. And the interesting thing is the first wash and 2 wash you take, you make an emulsion, it's going to take a few minutes to really fully separate it, 15, 20 minutes. When you get to those final washes, it's amazing. You'll shake that thing and agitate it as much as you can. I've even tried it with a immersion blender. You get this perfect, creamy looking emulsion. But once you've washed it, it'll swirl around and it'll just go like magic in about a minute. And it just really separates out. The water's foggy and a little bit yellow, but that oil just separates right up on the top. So over the process, depending on how careful you are with it, you might lose 30% of your volume. I've been measuring pretty carefully when I've been doing mine, and I'm not losing just a bit less than 20%. But given that it's about 5 times cheaper than anything else I could buy, it's kind of worth it. And I like the results, and I like to tinker. So, yeah.
Good science project with the kids as well, if it's got that impressive splitting time.
Yeah.
What templates do you use for doing this?
I use a gallon cider jug. So that's kind of just about the right amount that I can then handle it and agitate it without being totally destroyed at the end of the day. So when I do it, I'll do 2 quarts at a time now. So I've got 2, and so I'll do a quart of oil, 2 quarts of water in each of them, and I'll just do them kind of in sequence, one after the other. And I'll usually do all the washes in one go, and the first 2 or 3 rinses one day, and then the next day I'll do another rinse or 2. Normally that's how the further I go, like 3 washes, 3, 4 rinses, and be done with it. But if you do a lot more rinses and get more of that out of there, it just, because just like the oleic acid inhibits it, so does the mucilage and phospholipids. It actually slows the drying down, so the more you get rid of those, the faster everything else takes place. And it really clarifies it amazingly fast. And I can actually pull a little out and just drop it in the bowl of this guy. And you can see that, and that won't yellow as it dries.
Wow, yeah.
It's
nice and clear.
It's really quite clear.
Yeah. Which is ideal for maple that you don't want to yellow.
Right, right. I mean, that is as much darker as it gets, really. It's just the amount. I mean, it's even in some ways less than if you were to get it wet. So it really kind of makes a big difference. And then this will, if I were to leave this sitting out in the sun, it'll be dried, in half hour, 45 minutes tops. The stuff that's older and sits in the sun longer does dry, set faster. And that's it. Just that little bit that I wiped on is literally all I'll do. And then dry that off. And if I were to do a heat set, I'd check it again in 15 minutes, and that might, especially in the bottom of the bowl where there's long grains where it's not going through, some may still be sitting there, and I'll wipe that off, and that'll be good to go. And then and that's one of the big reasons why we do this is when you have this really pale wood, you don't want it to get dirty. It shows and stuff. So even just one little light coat makes a world of difference.
Very well done. So, there we have it. Spoon oils and sanding, finishing, burnishing, all explained in detail. Very well there, I thought, by Don. Thanks very much, Don, for sharing this information with us. I'm sure there'll be lots of people out there that can make use of this information, and hopefully we'll see some beautifully finished spoons coming out. That's it for now. Hopefully there'll be some more videos to follow shortly. I did manage to salvage some of the high-res footage that I got, so it should be a little bit of a better quality video of some carving coming shortly. But for now, thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.